Now, the philosophers that we're discussing here, Frege and Russell, have enormous effect on the living, yourself included. Now, I want to talk about the revival of interest in Frege after the Second World War, so that the interest in Frege and the interest in Russell, for the first time, proceed side by side into the age that, that we now live in.
It's very difficult to account for historical events, particularly in such short perspective.
Yeah.
And I think there certainly was, immediately after the war, a decline in Russell's influence, anyhow, in England. And this was, I think, not due to a revival of interest in Frege, but to an increased importance attached to the work of Wittgenstein and Moore. In Moore's case, though I enormously liked and respected him as a man, I think philosophically it was excessive. And I think this was two people responsible for this were partly not so much Ryle, who respected Russell, but mainly Austin, who was the linguistic philosopher in the narrowest possible sense, and had a great respect for Moore as someone who attached great importance to ordering his uses and to common sense and so on. Common sense was said by Russell, incidentally, to be the metaphysics of savages.
Yes,
and
yes.
I think it was the upgrading of Moore that was responsible for, at that time, for the downgrading of Russell. And this is a trend that's now been reversed, I'm glad to say.
I think you go a bit too far in saying Russell was downgraded, because if one thinks back to those post-war years and thinks now who were the major philosophers in the English-speaking world, the shortest of short lists would have to include, apart from Russell himself, Wittgenstein, Karl Popper, Quine, Gilbert Ryle, yourself, and all of you were massively influenced by Russell.
Yes. Perhaps yes, so you would know better than I, because you, after all, were up at Oxford in the 50s when I had already departed for London. But certainly the impression reaching us in London was that Russell was being undervalued.
That means you're taking an Oxford-based view, and I think that's what's mistaken about the view. I think there were other people around then who disparaged Russell. It's perfectly true.
Yes.
But their work and their influence hasn't lasted.
I'm very glad to hear this. Yeah. And Russell has recovered. Yes. He himself, perhaps I'm influenced by the fact that he himself thought this. Because I was seeing a great deal of him at the time. I organised a little group in London that he attended, and he was certainly miffed is perhaps too mild a word, but he thought that he wasn't getting his due, and all philosophers are slightly vain, and this certainly caused him pain.
But we agree, in any case, that he's come back.
He's come back, certainly. Yes. Now, the revival of Frege is something that I think can't explain. I don't even know exactly how it happened. Probably it started in America with the development of a school of logicians led by a man called Alonzo Church, who insisted on very great rigor in logic and mathematics, and found it in Frege and didn't find it in Russell and Whitehead. Though, of course, they did find it elsewhere. They found it, for example, in Hilbert, though they disagree with Hilbert for other reasons. And in England, it seems to have been, the first evidence I can find of it is in a book published fairly late, about 1960, I think, by William and Martha Neal, which is a very impressive history of logic, in which very great importance is given to Frege. He's put on a level with Aristotle. These are the two great names. And
I've jumped over one thing.
Yes. You suddenly remind me, there was a translation in the early 50s,
1950 itself.
1950 itself, was it? Made by Austin of Frege's Grundlagen, wasn't it? Yes. And then there was also a translation made 2 or 3 years later by Max Black, an Englishman working in America, and by Peter Geach, of two of Frege's very obscure but important semantic essays, one of them called Sense and Reference, and the other called Function and Concept. And so there was in the early 50s this sudden interest in Frege, but I'm not quite certain what led to it, or indeed what consequences it had.
Well, a lot of very bright younger people took it up, didn't they, and were influenced by it. Whether that'll last or not, I don't know, but it certainly seems to me to have been going on recently.
I find very little influence of Frege in current philosophical work, apart from the work of Dummett. If you look at, for example, I think now perhaps some of the most interesting work being done is being done in America, and if you look at the work of people like Quine and Putnam and Thomas Nagel and Donald Davidson in particular, you don't find so strong an influence of Frege, except perhaps in Davidson's case indirectly through the work of the Polish tradition Tarski on truth, which in a sense links up with Frege, as much as Frege linked meaning and truth.
Are you confident that the influence of Russell will last?
Yes.
You are. Why? Why so?
Because I think because that is the view I take of philosophy. I think that the questions he asked are the important philosophical questions, and I think that his answers to them, whether right or wrong, will always need to be taken into consideration.
And if I'm right about you too, you also think that his approach, his conception of what philosophy is the right conception.
Yes.
That it consists of clarification, therefore analysis, and justification, therefore argument, of our important beliefs.
Written in straightforward English prose. Oh, well, not necessarily English, but written
in straightforward prose.
In straightforward prose.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Ayer. Oh, Freddie, I thought that was splendid. I thought it was better than any of our run-throughs.